Interesting little stumble I did last night when I got done uploading my last video on comparing Bedini's switching circuit to the heart, not the entirety, but the core part of the Tesla special generator, namely the reciprocating piston portion. I ran across a patented idea from Portugal that dates back to 2003, I think it is. No, I think it was 2013. Well, anyway, Barbosa and Leal Captor, and it's very analogous not only to Tesla's special generator, but more significantly to Nathan Stubblefield's so-called Earth battery, which he never considered to be a battery anyway. He considered it to be a collector. And Nathan liked to plant his Earth battery among the roots of an old oak tree. And from the work of, General Spire of the United States Army. What was his name? George O. Spire. He used trees as grounded aerials, and the Captor device works just as well collecting electrons from the atmosphere as it does, well, not as well, actually, but it does work collecting electrons from the atmosphere as it does collecting electrons from the Earth. Yet a tree collects from both. And I've used trees extensively as a grounding rod when earthing my body. But here's a situation in which all the little root hairs of a living tree certainly help in collecting electrons from the Earth, and all the leaves. If you've got a conifer, that's even better because the leaves are on the tree all year round. So that's number 5 wire on the patent from Barbosa and Leal. The continuous number 4 wire, that's the current wire of an electromechanical watt-hour meter. The 3.1 and 3.2 leads of the number 3 wire, that's the voltage coil on an electromechanical watt-hour meter. The problem, of course, is that the wiring is all wrong. Those wires are correct on the armature of the electromechanical watt-hour meter, but the fact is, in an electromechanical watt-hour meter, the voltage coil and the current coil are wired together to the mains, and that's the problem. They should not be. They're separate wires. The current wire is the load wire, the number 4 wire in Barbosa and Leal. The current coil on the electromechanical watt-hour meter. And so that should be a separate wire, wired separately, disconnected. You know, the wiring is just a little different. Now the grounding pin on the Bakelite chassis, which is a cast iron chassis of my 1910 General Electric watt-hour meter, that could serve the same purpose as the connection point for the number 5 wire on the Barbosa and Leal patent. It's just a question of, in Clarence's posts to Energetic Forum, he did state that the number of grounding rods does matter, because if you don't have enough, the whole thing won't work. Now, I say that the number 3 wire is the voltage coil for a reason, because it's voltage alone that runs the darn thing. Obviously, wattage, the wattage is minor, the input wattage, as compared to what runs the thing. But what's going to vary? If they say that the current going into wire number 3 on Barbosa and Leal patent has the composition has to be the same as what you want the output wattage to be. Namely, if you want the output to be AC, then your input has to be AC. And it's all going into your transformer core. So that tells me the thing that's significant is voltage that's going into this, and not amperage. the amperage can be extremely low. In fact, I bet the lower the better. But the voltage characteristics has to be exactly what you want. So if what you take out is 240 volts AC, then it has to be 240 volts going in AC. But Nathan Stubblefield ran all of his motors off of DC output, even though some of them were AC motors, which is kind of weird. And he had 3 coils on his iron bolt. And those are the 3 coils that are required. He had an iron coil, a bare coil. He had a copper sheathed with cotton sleeve coil. And then he had a 3rd coil that was smaller. And nobody understood, well, what is that 3rd coil for? Well, that's, let's see. Let's give a think to this. What would it be? Besides, yeah, it was, interestingly enough, the ideology behind Nathan Stubblefield's earth battery is that you had to get it going. That the thought was you had to get it going with something, and then it would run perpetually after it's been sitting in the ground for at least a year. So that sounds the same conceptualization as Barbosa and Leal. The 3-wire, the number 3 wire, what I call the voltage coil, the input coil. I'm surprised that that also is not the same situation. Let's see if I can recall, if I get my ideas mixed up. Sometimes I do when I read several things. I don't remember which one I read from. You know, I don't recall. I'll have to go back and reread and to try to discriminate which idea is separate from which. There was one idea that you could disconnect the input wire. You only had to get it going at first, initiate it. But I can't remember if it was this one or it was something else. There was another one that was interesting because the input wire was half a mile long and it was like 6 inches above ground at a horizontal. And that sounds like the Barbosa and Leal is kind of like an Alexanderson antenna because you've got one grid of wires above ground and another below ground, grounded to the earth or surrounded by the earth. In that case, an Alexanderson antenna case. But in this other idea that I was reading, that it was a half a mile long wire, which when I think about it, well, wouldn't it be more better if it was a planar surface, a plane surface, a two-dimensional surface, or even just a two-dimensional grid of wires would be an improvement, because then you could sort of replicate a plane surface, come close to it, if the spaces between the crisscrossing wires are close enough. But it has to be close to the ground, apparently 6 inches, I believe it was. Of course, if it rains, now you've got an arcing between the two, and your source voltage would be useless. But apparently would be a good source for voltage, would be an aerial positioned 6 inches off the ground that's running at a horizontal. And the aerial could be crisscrossed wires, a mesh. Oh yeah, and it said the substances had to be a double valence, a 2 valence, like aluminum but it said other substances like silver, which is not double valence. That's weird. Yeah, there was a whole list. So it was another idea. So I thought that would make a good input if you're running just like DC input. But obviously, if you're doing AC input, that's the best on Barbosa and Leal, because if you get the voltage up higher than what you actually need, you could step your output coil, your continuous number 4 wire, the so-called current wire, because it's only wrapped a couple times, and that's what makes it look like a current coil from an electromechanical water ammeter. While the input number 3 wire is wrapped so many times, that starts to look like a voltage coil. So the output current coil could have a transformer on it to step down the voltage. But actually, no, what am I saying? The current coil already is a step down. The relationship between the output coil it is a current coil because the voltage has been stepped down. It's only wrapped 2 times. And the input coil is wrapped several more times, and that already looks like a step-down transformer as it is. So I'm sorry, I forgot about that part. Okay, now, one of the problems they're saying in Barbosa and Leal, the replication of Clarence, is all the work is in because you've got to have a lot of grounding rods, and that's a lot of work. You might even have to drill holes into the earth to get it down nice and deep, because, you know, when construction engineers put down a grounding rod, they usually use a 9-foot copper rod. Well, an orchard or a forest is perfect, because when we go back to General George O. Squire, letter O, middle initial O, all you need is a living tree, because you need the sap as a conduit just underneath the bark of the surface of the tree to make connection with an iron nail, because if you use copper, you'll kill the tree. So now we have an iron-oriented grounding system of a living tree. And if you've got an orchard or a forest, you've got a plentiful supply of grounding rods. And you just need to string them all together with wires. And I actually did that at one time, but I lost all my connections. I used conifers. They were Jeffrey pine, as I recall, which are, Jeffrey pine can tolerate city smog, so they can live in the city. And you've got a conifer year-round, or, you know, year-round leaf mass, so you've got an aerial collection of electrons. So it's fascinating that somebody has figured out how to make use of Edward Leedskalnin's perpetual motion holder and harvest the constant circulation of electrons inside that transformer-style structured iron core, laminate core. Let's see, there was something else. So, translating to Tesla's special generator, at least the Nazi version, is not that difficult. The reciprocating piston is obviously an AC generator, and which feeds into the voltage coil wrapped around a transformer, which could just as easily be connected to the hull of the ship. And then the current coil takes the load off of that to supply the load for the electric motor driving the propeller shaft of that Nazi U-boat. The hull, though, this gets interesting. The hull has to be insulated from, well, at first I thought, it has to be insulated. Well, yeah, it has to be insulated from the ocean, or else the corrosion of the salt water is going to deteriorate the hulls. Yet you have a loose coupling. Even if you put an insulator surrounding the hull, you've got a loose coupling between the conductivity of the ocean water and the conductivity of the hull. So the hull could be part of the transformer, coupled to it, magnetically coupled to it. And as I've said before, the language of Tesla, for every 200 pounds of iron added to the system, 1 horsepower is added, could be taken literally, that he's referring to the transformer core, or you could think of it as coded language, secret coded language, in which he's talking about the mass of iron windings that constitutes the voltage coil surrounding the transformer. We can use both to add to the advantage of the situation. So you have a very massive voltage coil winding, that's your input coil, and a very long length of wire, a thin wire, and the transformer could be magnetically bolted, or it could be bolted in order to magnetically coupled to the hull of the ship, which adds more iron, which adds more mass for the circulating, what did he call it? No, there was a guy on YouTube who named the 2 different circulating magnetic elements of Edward Leedskalnin's theory. which is very similar to Mendeleev's, the chemist who came up with the periodic chart. He had X and Y pre-hydrogen atomic elements. And according to this guy, oh God, I can't remember the guy's name. I source him in my playlist devoted to Stanley Meyer. I did spend some time on Mendeleev further down the playlist. tinyurl.com /Stan-Meyer. Stan-Meyer. That playlist, the Stan Meyer playlist on my Vinyasa channel, that I do bring that up, and the guy, I can't remember his name, he called them magnetons? Yeah, not magnetron, but a magneton. And there's the North Pole the North Pole magnetons and the South Pole magnetons, and they're separate, and they circulate in opposite directions, according to Edward Leedskalnin. He just didn't give them names. He just called them little magnets, little North Pole magnets and little South Pole magnets. And they circulate in opposite directions. So, if that's the case in a transformer core, then they're there. They're circulating in opposite directions. And we only give credit to one of them. In any case, here we have a situation in which they could be circulating within the hull of a Nazi U-boat or a hull of a ship. And if it's an insulated surface, it could be that you've got a loose coupling with the ocean. It could be that the number 5 wire on Barbosa and Leal patent could double as the core, the iron core, transformer core. Because if we've got it magnetically coupled to the hull of a ship and it's going through a conductive medium which is grounded to the earth, namely the ocean, it's quite possible that that loose coupling is sufficient because of the surface area of the hull of the ship. Might be sufficient to make loose coupling connection with the ocean water and thus with the earth to ground the iron core, so that the current wire, the continuous number 4 wire Barbosa and Leal patent, instead of the number 5 wire being looped around the number 4 wire, the output load wire, instead it's the core itself, the laminate, the transformer core itself, which is rendering loose coupling to the output number 4 continuous wire of the Barbosa and Leal patent, which is the current coil of the electromechanical watt-hour meter. Because the transformer core itself is the grounding connection to the earth, as well as doubling as the storehouse of little North Pole magnets and little South Pole magnets that are circulating inside that core, storing the energy that's going to be harvested by the Barbosa and Leal patent. So there's a lot of analogues, and it works just as well in the Nathan Stubblefield earth battery, that the iron bolt is the core, is the magnetizable iron core that stores the little North Pole magnets and the little South Pole magnets of Edward Leedskalnin's theory about how his perpetual motion holder works. Obviously, it's not his. Somebody else came up with the perpetual motion holder back in 1845, I believe it is, and that's on I don't think it's the Energetic Forum. It's the other forum that I seldom go to, the older forum that Aaron Murakami manages. Energy Science Forum, I think it's called. And I can't remember the guy's name. I think his last name is Dave or Davis. So Edward Leedskalnin was the inheritor. He inherited the ideology of the perpetual motion holder and took it and popularized it for us, but he did not invent it. Well, he may have come up with it independently and not known about the other guy, but the other guy did come up with it earlier than did Edward Leal Scotland. So this idea keeps resurfacing. So what is that? That's over 150 years, over 160 years that this idea keeps coming up. It's a very interesting concept because it can be DC or AC, your choice. And yet, gosh, it's so fascinating. It's very interesting. Now, the enhancement, where does the aluminum come into the picture? We obviously know where the copper and the iron comes into the picture, but where does the aluminum come into the picture? The aluminum is the shell. You create a shell, a chassis around it. And then if you've got circulating air in between the aluminum chassis and the device, if you have any aluminum parts within the device's structure, as the counterpoise to the aluminum shell and the air mass in between, now you've got yourself an electrostatic field. And the spinning disk of a watt-hour meter kind of lends itself to the notion that it could have been a homopolar disk that was run by compressed air, causing it to spin. And that would help flush out the interior to prevent arcing. But an electrostatic battery is what this electrostatic field is. So the Hutchison effect may or may not be a contributing conceptual or contributing concept to the operation of these designs. At the very least, it's an analog to an electrolytic battery that serves as a kind of, well, it's not just a storehouse, but it's an equalizing force to help balance out variations. You know, load demand can vary. An electrostatic field will help soak up some of that variance to try to even it out. So an electrostatic field is significant in the context of this device. In the case of a Nathan Stubblefield battery, I'd have to take a guess what the electrostatic field would be. I guess the fact that I don't know what the atmosphere has to do with it, especially if you're dealing with a tree. Tree does have a voltage gain as you work your way up the trunk, as opposed to the root, or as opposed to the ground for that matter. There becomes a voltage difference as you elevate your way upwards the tree. And General George Squire did say that it's optimal to hammer your nail 2/3 up the height of the tree. I guess the earth itself becomes the electrostatic field. The atmosphere and the ground. Yeah. Yeah, I guess so. There's no other way to think of it, in a sense. You know, the EV Gray motor tried to be its transportable, a mobile version, fully encapsulated and control all the parts, and it was very powerful, but you did have to take responsibility for all the elements. Some of these other implementations you don't have to because it makes use of the earth as a few of those elements or factors. So it's very fascinating idea. I'm just going to have to do more reading to try to find, I think, despite the fact that the Energetic Forum initial posts of Clarence, the elements of the post have been removed that tells us what he did. But I think it's been sourced elsewhere on the internet, and I think it's It's just a question of finding it. And I think I've already read it too, as I recall. So I'll have to go back and reread again what I was looking up. I just wanted to post my idea that it's starting to look very similar. Yeah, the Hutchison effect may not be appropriate. Even though it looks similar, it may not have anything to do with it. But an electrostatic field does have something to do with it. In order to act as an analog for a battery, to store this, and to have an additional storage of energy, in addition to the core, the iron core, is to have an electrostatic field surrounding this whole device. Because that's what I did at earthinglife.info. I learned to take, see, I didn't have all the elements. I had just a few. I had the input coil, the number 3 wire, and I had the iron core, and I had the voltage difference between 3.1 and 3.2 on the Barbosa and Leal patent was my body, and the earthing bed sheet was, let's say 3.1, and 3.2 was the earth. So that's what I was doing in terms of my voltage difference. And I had a single layer of winding on the toroidal coil. I had 2 toroidal coils, one wound clockwise and the other wound counterclockwise, and they were connected in series. So I had this wire going between the earthing bed sheet and my body and the earth, actually to a tree, now that I recall. I went to a tree first, a conifer. And so that was the so-called voltage coil, the input coil. Because there's no current to speak of on an open circuit, on an open wire, but you got voltage signals going between the two that are balancing out the voltage differences between the 2 points. So we've got a varying voltage, a varying current, very minuscule current, and not too large a voltage difference either, unfortunately. But structurally speaking, that's the number 3 wire on the Barbosa and Leal patent, and you've got the iron core. But what I had extra that's not in the patent is I had aluminum foil shell immediately surrounding in one version, and I have a picture of it, and I think I used it. That's right, because I was trying to study the Tesla patent of his aerial collection, electron collection, applied to the collector plate was the earthing bed sheet, and in place of the capacitor, I put in the coil, the iron core coil of wire, which Eric Dollard said completely defeats the purpose, but in terms of the Barbosa and Leal patent, it's exactly what's required for the input wire. To have a voltage difference between an aerial and ground. Except you neutralize the voltage difference by having a coil of wire around an iron core instead of having a capacitor. But that's what I had. But I had an aluminum shell surrounding it, and I found the energy value to sleep on was very contradictory. It would be better to have it strictly to wake up in the morning instead of coffee. You lay down on, instantly you're energized. It's unbelievable. So I found I had to put a separation between the aluminum shell surrounding that iron core, the iron core winding, and put sand in there as a dielectric to store that charge, to be able to sleep on it, to be able to relax and sleep. Otherwise, it was just tremendously energizing, because there's hardly any space, just a little air gap in between the aluminum shell, the aluminum foil shell, surrounding its inner plate. I took to be the iron core was the other plate to that capacitor. So I had a capacitor, all right, but I had it different than Tesla's. I did not have one plate connected to the aerial and the other plate connected to the ground. I had the iron core as one plate, both plates floating, and the other plate was the aluminum foil surrounding this primary. We can call it a primary winding around the iron coil. The number 3 wire is like a primary, and the number 4 continuous wire is like the secondary, or the current coil in an electromechanical water ammeter is the secondary. So it had some similarities, but there was, various elements missing, and the fact was that I had the 3.2, let's call it, wire grounded to the earth. Well, something could be said that wasn't exactly wrong to do it that way instead of having the number 5 wire separate. It's just that I don't have a load wire. There's no load. That's the problem. So I've got all the elements more or less except the load. There's no loads being supplied here. It's collecting the voltage difference, and it's even grounded to the earth, and it's got the iron core, but there's no load wire supplying a load, no supply wire. So it's an interesting. I came very close to duplicating Barbosa and Leal, but I didn't go all the way because I didn't realize, because I wasn't trying to apply it to supply power to a device. I never intended to. I intended it only to supply power to a sleeping body on an earthing bed sheet, and for that purpose, it was totally satisfactory. But if you took away the sand and reduced the space between the aluminum shell and the iron core, it became so powerful, all I needed was one more wire looped around the core to act as the load wire, to supply the load. And it would have been a Barbosa and Leal patent with the added advantage of capacitance building up an electrostatic battery, taken from the ideology of Bedini's replication of the so-called Tesla switch, which I misrepresented a few videos ago of the Hutchison Effect, which might not be a misrepresentation. It might be the Hutchison Effect in a loose kind of way, a loosey-goose kind of way, structurally, conceptually speaking. But be that as it may, whether Hutchison Effect is involved or not, I don't know at this point. But the battery conceptualization of Bedini's switching circuits is conceptually transferable to an electrostatic field surrounding this device, which nobody has included, I don't think, in the Barbosa and Leal replications. But I think it would help, and I think it's applicable. So the ideology is, or the conceptualization is, gradually evolving, and it looks pretty good. So my contribution is, if you're living near a forest or an orchard, then you don't have to deal with multiple grounding rods. It saves you a lot of work. Just an idea. Of course, I just happened to be surrounded by an orchard, and my last residence just happened to be in the middle of a forest, a conifer forest. So it's been fortuitous. I like trees. I don't know. Must be my karma at the moment. Now, obviously, in the old days, we don't have aerials anymore on our rooftops because of the digitization of TV broadcast. God, there must be a reason. I knew there was a reason why they did that a few years ago. It was because the patent came out around that sometime in and around that time frame. So they wanted to get rid of all the aerials because they could have been used as a neighborhood network of grounding rods. You've got an aerial, all you have to do is ground it, and each person's home could be just one grounding location that a whole neighborhood, what do we call them? Neighborhood watch. One whole neighborhood watch group could get together and form a network of grounded aerials to service their whole neighborhood station for generating power. So obviously, it would be to divide and conquer us, to get us distracted and take away that element of possibility that we could band together and power each neighborhood individually, separately, with regard to any other neighborhood, so that, well, obviously it could grow. I mean, heck, you've got your pole transformers, each one is grounded. So, but it's spread out along a whole string. And this is in the forest. They have the situation above ground. Anyway, but a forest or an orchard, or in the old days, well, we had aerials on the rooftops of every home to bring in TV broadcast or radio broadcast. If people still have aerials on their rooftop, that's a source right there to network together all those aerials and add a grounding rod to each one, and you've got yourself a superb situation. So you don't have to have an orchard, you don't have to have a forest. I remember initially when I started working with grounded aerials or aerials for grounding my earthing appliance that I was sleeping on, my earthing bed sheet, I started out with a strip of aluminum foil on my rooftop. I was living in a guest house, and it was a tar roof, tar surface, flat but at a slight angle, and it had gravel on top. That's usually the way a tar roof works. So I just pushed aside the gravel wide enough to lay down the aluminum foil sheet, and I made it quite long, and then I pushed a little bit of the gravel back to anchor the edges of the sheet so the wind wouldn't blow it away. And I found that it was not as beneficial as a tree. We had an elm tree right by the guest house there where I was living 3 years ago. And the elm tree served very well. And George Squire said it does not have to be a conifer. It can be a deciduous tree. It just has to be a living tree. Because the branch work of that tree apparently is still working as an antenna. You just lost all the leaf mass, which probably boosts it to collect electrons from the air during the summertime. But it still works as an aerial. So I did find it was advantageous over the strip of aluminum foil on my roof, because I grounded that. I wanted to make a grounded aerial. I wanted to duplicate a tree first before I went to a tree. I wanted to see if I could make a homespun version of a tree, and it turned out to be not as good as a tree is. But if you're, I had a flu. I was in another guest house immediately after that one, in which the water heater was outside the building for the bathroom, and that had a flue going up, a flue stack going up from the water heater, elevated to above the roof line. And I measured the flue was an aluminum shell, and it was already grounded to the earth, so it was a grounded aerial right there. And the pipe coming out of or going into the water heater was connected to the flue. So I simply grounded my earthing bedsheet experiment to that pipe, and I had myself a grounded aerial. So there, if you go around the house and you look for protrusions, usually there are iron pipe protrusions coming out of the roof, and those tend to be grounded, as I recall. So you've got the basis of a grounded aerial very often, very frequently on the rooftop of a house. And that at least serves as one. And that's connected to the neutral, I believe, of the electrical wiring of that building. So you've got the basis of a network, potentially a network of grounded aerials in any neighborhood. So you could create your own forest, so to speak, of grounded aerials if you don't have a forest of trees or an orchard of trees. you could band together in a neighborhood and create a network of grounded aerials to serve the same purpose, to serve as the grounding collector of the Barbosa and Leal patent. Okay. The whole point of an electrostatic field is that it behaves like a battery, a reserve. A capacitor is not a reserve. A capacitor analogy is more similar to the backboard behind a basketball hoop, in which you bounce the ball off the backboard to make a bank shot into the hoop. So a capacitor is simply a reflector, which is why aluminum would work so well in that situation, in that capacity, pun intended. Little geek joke there. Oh no, I can't stop laughing. Once I get started, I can't stop laughing. I'm sorry, I feel goofy. But a battery is a reserve, and so an electrostatic field has to be stable enough in order to operate as a reserve, and thus operate like a battery, and thus be capable of being called an electrostatic battery, as opposed to the more common type of battery, which I like to call now an electrolytic battery, to make the distinction. Because the battery, the whole point of a battery is a reserve. That's the point of the term battery, is a reserve. So when you have an electrostatic field, it has to be stable, because that's the quality of a reserve, is that no matter what you do, it remains stable as a source of electrostatic or voltage charge. Okay. Don't kill the dipole, right? So it's got to be stable to give us a voltage difference between what, as a reference. Oh, that's always different. Oh, then you can draw from it. So that's the whole point of an EV Gray motor. The chassis is the earth ground. That's why the EV Gray motor works in the Richard Hackenberger version, because it doesn't need an earth ground in order to operate. It's got its own earth ground. It carries around with it all the time. A very stable, a very strong electrostatic reserve. Namely, the voltage difference between certain aluminum supporting structures parts on the interior that support, I think it's the rotors, and the chassis, and the Teflon lining the interior of the chassis in between, serving as part of the dielectric, the immobile part, and the air compressed flowing through it as the mobile part that varies, that prevents a buildup of charge and arcing that would, of course, destroy its capacitance if it arced inside. So the quantity, the numerousness of grounding rods required in Barbosa and Leal's patent is an indication to me that the earth, you've got a single line. That's a single wire when you ground to the earth. That's an electrostatic reserve you're grounding yourself to. It's not electromagnetic. You need a return wire for that. So a single wire, an open circuit, is an electrostatic connection. And so the earth is being used as an electrostatic reserve. Reference, an electrostatic reference that's stable enough to serve as a reference, because unfortunately electrostatics is very fragile. When you have a circuit, an electromagnetic circuit, in the midst of surrounded by an electrostatic field, there's an interaction between the two, and if anything's going to flatten out and get drained, it'll be the electrostatic field, not the electromagnetic circuitry. And that's probably why it's been so easy for us to become ignorant and maintain our ignorance of the value of electrostatic circuitry engineering within the context of a circuitry, and thus lose the value of the over unity devices that were composed over a century ago, or nearly a century ago, or a century ago. They already knew about this Barbosa and Leal, so this concept. It's had to resurface because it's a simple idea, it's a good idea, and it keeps coming back at us. But understanding it helps even better. Is what we're doing is we're grounding to an electrostatic reserve. And if you can take your reserve with you wherever you go, then it becomes mobile and you don't have to ground anymore. And that's what the EV Gray motor, according to the last version that Richard Hackenberger had devised or designed, modified, was a mobile version of an electrostatic field surrounding the entirety of the motor, incorporating the chassis. So it's a reserve. It's the quality of reserve, the stability of the electrostatic field, because the amperage, or the wattage, let's say, within an electrostatic field tends to be very minor. And so that's why an electromagnetic circuit immersed in that field, if connected to it, would drain it so rapidly under normal circumstances, because we're not mindful of the fact that the electrostatic field is helpful because it doesn't last long enough for us to notice, because we don't bother to make it stable. If we had bothered to make that electrostatic field stable, we'd see, oh my God, look at that, what's going on here? It's making the circuit, it's giving it a boost. And that's probably why Tesla came up with a special formula for slathering onto coiled windings, the beeswax, rosin, pine rosin, and 5% carnauba wax, because that's a dielectrical mixture. And so that's exhibiting electrostatic characteristics by behaving like a dielectric. So it's turning the coil of wire into the dielectric sandwich between two, presumably, voltage sources. Maybe the coil inside and the airspace outside. So, you know, we don't think about stability of electrostatic fields surrounding our circuitry. How that can boost the circuitry and add in the environment as an element, as seemingly as an indeterminable source of electric charge, of voltage potential. And it's all about don't kill the dipole. You know, Tom Bearden, don't kill the dipole. Well, why not? Don't ignore the dipole. Don't ignore the environmental dipole. Don't ignore any kind of voltage-oriented difference between your circuit and its environment that might exist, and enhance it, nurse it, protect it. Protect it. Use it and protect it. See? So it's a very significant idea, but it's a very flexible idea if we know what we're doing. That's all. So it's possible to make our machines work the way they should be working. It just takes a little bit more of ingenuity to engineer that consideration into our circuitry. Just a little bit. Teensy-weensy little bit. I had an idea also that one alternative to feeding the number 3 wire in the Barbosa and Leal patent would be to use a magnetic field of a permanent magnet, such as a neo bar magnet. And ferrofluids could be used to determine where is the strongest field coming out of the edges of the bar magnet. You know, would you put a coil around the square end if that's the north, and then the square end if that's the south, one at each? Kind of like not exactly a pancake coil, because it's the edges where the strength, the strongest strength of a magnetic field comes out of a permanent magnet. We should really be designing our magnets differently if we're going to be putting coils of wire around them to capture their magnetic field. But maybe, since I like to think that magnetism is a voltage-oriented phenomenon, not an amperage phenomenon, I know we like to call it that, but that's only if we move a magnet in a wire or a wire within a magnetic field. If we don't move them, then it's strictly voltage-oriented. If it's two separate coils, one at the north pole and one at the south pole of a permanent magnet, that's the way I like to think of it. Whether or not it's true, I don't know, but that's the way I like to think of it. So I'm supposing here, completely imaginary, that the source voltage for the number 3 wire, the 3.1 and the 3.2 ends, could be the north and the south poles, two separate coils attached to a permanent magnet. And and that well, that would be a DC version. Of course, if you want an AC, the reciprocating piston could service, you know, in the William Lyne's description of Tesla's trimetal generator, the reciprocating piston could be an alternator, a source for alternating voltage polarity to supply the voltage input on the number 3 wire, the 3.1 and the 3.2. But anyway, I thought a permanent magnet might be a solution, might be a option, because I used it in my earthinglife.info device to add to the overall device state, to boost the signals that were going between the earthing bedsheet and the grounding rod outside the home. You know, not just have a coil of wire around an iron core coil, not just have a toroidal core, not just have 2 toroidal cores, one wound clockwise and the other wound counterclockwise in series connection between them, sandwiched together, but have a bar neomagnet either in their center, ideally, or attached to their surface. I think I put it in between them in one case, because it does seem to boost the overall performance of the device. I just didn't know what I was doing. Now, using Barbosa and Leal, I know better how to configure the geometry of that situation and add a pickup coil to act as a secondary to supply the load of some device, because I never intended that experiment to power any kind of device. I was just intending it to boost the earthing experience so that I could get more out of the earthing experience, the earthing appliances that I was using. Anywho.